Okay, well, good morning, everybody. I think we're about ready to get started as we see the attendees pouring in. Thanks so much for spending your day with us. I'm really excited to talk about a pretty timely topic. My name is Paige Pitcher, and I'm head of strategic partnerships here at Moderne Ventures. So this is potentially the most pressing issue of our industry and maybe even this time. And we have gathered some amazing specialists and experts today, and we're really excited to be presenting alongside Kirkland and Ellis. So we're going to cover the regulatory, practical, and even technological aspects of ESG, both in the real estate industry and beyond. We're going to cover this from a global, from a national, and even down to a building level so that we can understand what can be done, what should be done, and what must be done from a compliance aspect to keep you ahead of the curve for ESG. The SEC published their guidelines about a year ago, 363 days, but who's counting? And the effect will take place next year in 2024, but we need to use this year, 2023, to do much, much more. This is the year to make your battle plan. This is the year to tackle your disclosures, set the framework, make intelligent targets, and even revisit some of your old benchmarks as we learn and discover more about Scope 3. We'll talk more about this later today. We expect the final ruling to be imminent, but we're going to take this opportunity to highlight some of the most important things that you can do to take action now. So Moderne is not your sort of average venture fund. We are an early stage venture fund that invests in technology companies supporting and specific to real estate and its adjacent industries like finance, insurance, and home services. But ESG has only grown in prominence, and we're spending a ton of time there. It's the most important vertical, I think, to the real estate industry because of our global footprint of emissions. Almost 40% is what we're responsible for from an operational and embodied carbon standpoint. Now, that's probably not a new stat to most of you on this call, but it's different this time. And there's a few reasons why. We've easily been through 3 different epochs of sustainability over time. But this time it's not just different, it's bigger. We have hit bedrock. The change is permanent. And the pressure's coming at us from both sides, both positive reinforcement and negative consequences. We're all familiar with part of the cost of inaction because we can quantify it to a certain degree. It's not just more costly to operate an inefficient building, but the market for these assets is also shrinking. Government regulation is assessing and doling out fines for underperforming buildings, starting next year in New York, starting this year in California. Physical risk and resiliency concerns are increasing our premiums at our properties for especially ones that are not well located. And finally, investors are demanding this transparency into data in real estate corporate performance, not just coming from policies and public regulations. But when it is dealt with, ESG, we know, provides better returns. We know that companies receive a lower cost of capital for higher performing real estate assets. And they're performing better on every single fundamental, from occupancy to rents to cap rates. There's also a lot of incentives out there right now, and I don't think those are going away, excuse me, anytime soon. Incentive-Find is one example of a modern company that can help you tackle and access those incentives in this space. So Moderne is helping the industry, well, modernize in order to reap these benefits and reduce the risk associated with meeting the demands of ESG. We've invested up and down the ESG spectrum. We're not just focused exclusively on sustainability. We look at companies that help reduce the carbon emissions, yes, but also help support the well-being, even financial well-being of occupants in buildings and communities. So much of the focus today will be spent on sustainability, of course, because it's the most pressing. It has a dollar value tied to it, and it's discrete enough to measure. But right behind ESG, mark my words, sustainability and governance standards will rise to importance. So we've been looking at this spectrum, and we're helping real estate firms and technology companies and stakeholders put all the pieces together. And stakeholders you're going to hear from today, insurance carriers, legal counsel, and even financial institutions are all part of this solution. And we're doing it with part of a 3-sided approach, a 3-sided platform. So we have first and foremost our venture fund. That's where we're investing in technology companies that are early but established. And you're going to hear from 3 of those companies today. We have a passport program. This is intended to bring companies into the real estate industry and accelerate their sales and growth. Some of the companies that are we're looking at are also outside real estate, but really have important impacts here. And finally, being able to build that connective tissue in the network. Over the past 10 years, we've built a network of about 700 corporations and executives. That's my job as part of strategic partnerships to help create those connections for the betterment of the industry. And so this is how we're going to put it all together today. Each single side of this platform is involved in this webinar. This is not just your average webinar. I want you to leave here with something different. There are no less than 3 webinars happening this week discussing ESG for real estate. But we're going to do things a little bit differently. Here, we're balancing information with impact and education with action. Legal research and regulations are going to be dialed down to real-world tactics and technologies that you can pick up today and actually use. We want you to leave here equipped today with 3 things. New knowledge that is actionable, then items that you can pick up and use on a certain timeline. You know, this is not just information for, oh, maybe I'll think about it next year. This is really something you can take away today. So whether you're background tasking and answering emails, or whether you're in the commute and listening to us, I want you to mentally or physically write down 3 boxes. My goal here today is that you have at least 3 people to reach out to inside or outside your organization with an idea or initiative to carry forward. So without further ado, here's the stellar list of speakers that you're going to hear from today. You're going to be hearing from 2 main sections of the program. First, we're going to start with the big picture and the policy and regulation piece. And secondly, we're going to get into some actionable technology. And please do go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A for us. We're going to collect those and kind of address those as a final reflection set at the end. So please don't be shy, and we will try and collate as many of those we can to get the major themes pulled out so that will make your 3 boxes you need to fill out a little easier. So I wanted to introduce our super gracious hosts here and the first 2 speakers. Paul Barker and Alex Farmer are going to be representing the ESG Impact practice at Kirkland and Ellis. They're going to present first on the global trends. That will be Paul. And secondly, we're going to get down into US-specific climate regulation. And we'll keep going from there with our specific speakers on the technology side. So for the big picture, I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Alex and Paul.
Thanks so much, Paige. It's a really great intro, and we're going to share our slides now. I'm going to kick off with taking a look at the voluntary climate action and disclosure and the global trends, as you say. So turning to the next slide, as we all know, over the past few years, investors and companies globally have come under increasing pressure to make climate commitments, such as setting emissions reductions or net zero targets, as well as coming under pressure to make more detailed disclosure of climate-related risks. And this proliferation of climate claims, commitments, disclosure from the private sector has been driven by a combination of market-led voluntary action, as well as now increasingly by mandatory regulation. And both of these trends largely emerged since the Paris Agreement in 2015, and then have really started to gain momentum around the time of the COP26 UN climate conference in Glasgow back in 2021. And we'll come to the regulatory drivers in a bit, but taking a look at the slide and the market factors there on the left-hand side, there on the left, you'll be familiar with many of these, including the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, investor-led climate initiatives such as the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, ESG data initiatives such as the ESG Data Convergence Project, which is led by major sponsors and LPs, and importantly, disclosure frameworks and standards, particularly the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure recommendations, which I'll come back to. But jumping forward to the next slide, private capital is clearly critical to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. It's going to require trillions of dollars annually, as we all know, in energy transition, in climate mitigation and adaptation. And a prime example of voluntary action is GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which, as set out there on the slide, comprises several sub-networks of major financial institutions that have committed to aligning their financing and investment activities with net zero by 2050. So we have the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance and the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative listed there that includes major sponsors and LPs respectively. And shifting forward to the next slide and to the TCFD recommendations that I mentioned a moment ago, these have had a big influence both on voluntary reporting and also regulation that's now emerging. And a key rationale underpinning the TCFD recommendations is the need for greater transparency around the pricing of climate risk. And the idea being that this will support more informed, better decisions, and more efficient capital allocation decisions in future with the benefit of climate-related disclosures. But taking a closer look at the recommendations themselves on the slide there, you'll see that they're structured around 4 key thematic pillars. Firstly, governance and essentially how an organization or a company establishes its governance around climate risk and opportunity. Second, strategy, which considers the impacts of climate-related risks on an organization's business and strategy, and also opportunities. Third, risk management, and these are the processes by which the company, the organization disclosing, identifies, assesses, and manages its climate-related risks. And then finally, the fourth pillar there is metrics and targets, and this concerns the metrics, the targets that are used to both assess and manage relevant climate-related risks and opportunities. As you'll see there, each of these pillars in the framework is supported by 2 or 3 specific recommended disclosures, so there are 11 in total. Now, market and regulatory tensions increasingly focused on more robust disclosures, and we're seeing particularly a focus on metrics and targets, and also on transition plans. So as companies make net zero pledges, there's now an increased focus from stakeholders on what the plans are that companies have in order to achieve these targets and transition to a lower carbon economy over time. And as a result, TCFD has published additional guidance on metrics, on targets and transition plans, and they're particularly focused on certain metrics concerning GHG emissions. So they now, in the TCFD recommendations, require disclosure of scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, regardless of materiality. And then the TCFD now also encourages organizations to disclose scope 3 emissions, although scope 3 does remain subject to materiality. And then finally on this slide, just looking back there in the scenario, in the strategy column, another aspect I'd flag is the increasing focus on scenario analysis, which is there at the bottom under the strategy pillar. Now, scenarios are descriptions of a hypothetical future. It's not a forecast, but companies use these scenarios to evaluate their longer term strategy. And the idea being that they ask themselves, what would the implications be for the company's strategy if a certain climate scenario occurred in future? For example, if there was a global warming of 3 degrees Celsius, what would the physical and transition risk be? So we're seeing increased focus on scenario analysis as well as metrics and targets under TCFD. But if we shift forward to the next slide, what we're seeing now is a clear shift from voluntary disclosure to mandatory climate disclosure in major jurisdictions around the world, as you'll see there on the slide. And this is particularly as concerns have mounted over greenwashing risk, and regulators are increasingly focused on that. Now, the TCFD recommendations, interestingly, they started out as with voluntary recommendations, as I said, but it's now forming the basis for much of this regulation in Europe, in the UK, in several key jurisdictions in Asia, and now also in the US with the SEC's proposed climate rule that Alex will speak to in a moment. But taking a look on the next slide, if we look at another voluntary standard, and this is the SBTI standard, which has emerged in the past couple of years. In particular, the SBTI stands for Science-Based Target Initiative, and they have, as of late 2021, established a corporate net zero standard, And that provides a framework by which companies can set net zero targets, including scope 3 emissions, that are then validated by SBTi as being in line with the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal of the Paris Agreement. Now, there's a lot of interesting detail. One of the major areas of focus right now is the role of carbon credits, also known as offsets, in achieving the SBTi standard, and precisely to what extent can companies rely on carbon credits and offsets. And this is an area that we advise on a lot and we'll all be keeping a close eye on, because at the moment there's uncertainty and there will be iteration of the SBTi standard over time. But if we go to my final slide for now, before I hand back to Alex, like, what are some of the risks and best practices surrounding climate commitments and emissions reduction targets? Well, clearly greenwashing risk, both reputationally and also from a litigation or regulatory enforcement risk perspective, that is a real concern. And stakeholders, including regulators, are increasingly scrutinizing climate-related disclosures. Now, interestingly, as a result, companies may now actually even be green hushing, which is a term that was coined by South Pole last year to describe how corporates that are setting climate targets are choosing to not actually publicize them out of a concern that the risks outweigh the reputational benefits of disclosure. So it's an interesting phenomenon, and Alex will get into some of the regulatory and other risks that are emerging. But in terms of best practices, I think a key message, and Paige already hinted at this, is that it's always important to involve your legal compliance team in decisions around climate commitments. Risk can also be mitigated by following relevant frameworks and guidance, which enables disclosures to provide that sufficient context, detail, specificity, the substantiation necessary to help mitigate risk around disclosures. And then, of course, there's sector-specific guidance that can be helpful. And I've flagged there on the slide the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, PCAF, which produces draft guidance on GHG emissions accounting for the real estate sector. And as you're aware, real estate investments, particularly certain types of investment, downstream leased assets, these pose challenges from a GHG accounting perspective, given that responsibility for emissions is usually distributed amongst landlords, tenants, and there are in the real estate sector there are several technical distinctions, such as the difference between operational and embodied carbon. So it's a tricky area for GHG accounting and climate generally, and we can expect more guidance and more regulation, including the local regulation that Paige mentioned, focused on real estate and real estate financed emissions going forward. But with that brief snapshot, Alex, I'll hand over to you for the regulatory take.
All right, thanks, Paul, and thanks so much to Paige and others at Moderne Ventures for inviting us to join you on this presentation today. Venture and real estate are both dear to my heart due to the capacity for innovation and transformation. So combining those today has been very interesting, and I look forward to hearing what the other panelists have to share as well. So the landscape that Paul has shared, as he said, there's a global movement around enhancing climate disclosures, climate action, and we've seen that with the current administration here in the United States as well. The SEC has been very active, as Paige mentioned, issuing their landmark climate disclosure rule last year in its proposed form. We're expecting to potentially see a final rule in April, just next month of this year, but we anticipate there is some chatter that may be pushed back a bit as well. There's been a number of other rules that have been issued by the SEC, so I wanted to give you a quick update on those as well. Lots of focus on cybersecurity. We've seen new ESG disclosure rules issued for private funds as well as registered funds. And for the registered funds, they may involve some greenhouse gas disclosure requirements as well. So that's noteworthy for any, sponsor held companies that are held by some of the funds that are going to be subject to these new rules in the future. There's the human capital management disclosure rule. We're anticipating that's already existing. We're anticipating that may become more robust and anticipating a proposed rule as early as next month. And then we've got some rules focused on board diversity as well. Try my own slides. So I wanted to highlight a few elements of the climate rule, and we could certainly talk about this for hours, and I have. It really draws on the TCFD guidance that Paul was discussing and builds in its own way. Like any US rule, makes its own changes, can't adhere to the masses. So have to have differences in some ways, but it largely follows the TCF guidance in terms of focusing on governance, risk, strategy, and metrics and targets, which are the 4 pillars that Paul went through. On the metrics and target side, it requires scope 1 and 2 emissions, and for larger companies, scope 3 emissions. That's one of the most controversial elements of the rule. If the scope 3 emissions are material, or if the company has set a scope 3 emissions target, we anticipate there's been some chatter that may be carved back, changed, or potentially eliminated entirely, the scope 3 requirement, but that remains to be seen. Personally, I think some of the rumors that we're hearing are strategic potentially, if they're going to keep the scope 3 requirement in some form. Keeps mouths busy, just wondering, I suppose. And then we also may see some movement on the financial statement metrics requirements. Those are notoriously difficult to comply with, and mostly because there aren't systems or accounting systems in place for that. And then we will expect, as I mentioned earlier, we'll expect to see that as early as next month. Potentially more interesting for the real estate space, and this remains to be seen, but is the rule that has now been proposed by the Biden administration to amend the federal acquisition regulations. The reason I say it's more interesting than the SEC, or potentially more impactful than the SEC climate rule, is because it applies to private companies as well. It depends on the value of the federal contracts that are held by a given company. The significant contractors are those that receive between $7.5 million and $50 million in federal contracts for the fiscal year. And major contractors is defined as those that receive over $50 million in federal contracts for the previous year. Both of those categories will have to complete an annual survey of greenhouse gas emissions and disclose scope 1 and 2 emissions. So that lines up with the climate rule from the SEC. That applies to public companies, and major contractors must also disclose scope 3. So there's no materiality trigger, or if they have a goal or target trigger for that scope 3 requirement. It's just required if they're a major contractor. In addition, the major contractors must disclose those portions of the CDP, formerly known as the Climate Disclosure Project. So the CDP, Climate Change Questionnaire, that are aligned with TCFD again. And major contractors must also, and it's the most controversial part of this rule, develop science-based targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And it must be validated by the SBTI, which Paul just mentioned. So we'll see what happens. The comment period for the proposed rule has now closed, and we could see the final rule as early as late this year or early next. And then if it goes into effect as proposed, the scope 1 and 2 inventory requirements would come in online 1 year after the final rule is published, the scope 3 2 years after the final rule is published, and then the SBTI validated target. That part's a little bit ambiguous, but potentially 2 years after the final rule is published as well. On the flip side, we're also seeing quite a bit of chatter, as you've probably seen in the news, DeSantis and others criticizing ESG, the ESG backlash or anti-ESG movement, whichever you want to call it. This comes in 2 forms, and there are also some other novel approaches coming into play from various states, but largely 2 forms. The first one is the anti-boycott form. That means that the red states, if you will, are targeting any activity, investing, lending, et cetera, that has a prejudicial effect essentially on certain sectors. So fossil fuels, firearms, and then some states have other kind of focused sectors as well. The other flavor of this is a restriction on what the investor, in most cases the pension fund or the state contracting entity, can consider in making their decisions. And that would restrict the ability to consider ESG as one of those factors. We've just seen Biden at the federal level just issue his first veto on the attempted rollback of the Department of Labor's rule that follows this same flavor, saying you can or cannot consider ESG in your decision making, your fiduciary considerations. And so we see that at the state level as well. Just in the last 4 to 6 weeks, there's been an additional 80 bills at the state level. So this map is changing every day. And this one was current as of February 1st. So there's even more movement since then. Finally, we're seeing a lot of focus on issuing new ESG regulation in the European Union, as well as all of its member states, and additionally, the United Kingdom. We've seen the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation have the most impact on the private markets. So funds that are launched have to be categorized according to this regulation. And that categorization can then have some downstream impact for their due diligence and for their ultimately for their monitoring of those investments, requiring portfolio companies to generate more and more data. In those cases, the principal adverse impact data, many of which align with resources use like greenhouse gas emissions, but also water use, waste, and other categories that are frequently important to real estate as well. We've got the taxonomies that are being issued and developed across the EU, but also in other countries to define essentially what is a sustainable activity in line with their regulation. The EU has issued their taxonomies for the environmental activities, and we're expecting a social taxonomy as well at some point. And there's a number of other, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD. All of these are going to just require more and more data from the companies or their sponsors. So what can you do about all of this? First of all, you have to embrace the fact that ESG is not a static state. I've done that. I'm not sure I anticipated just how much it would be changing every day when I launched this practice, but now it's essentially you're on a surfboard trying to rebalance every day the demands and the drivers that are coming towards any given company or firm, or in this case, a practice. And these are just some tips that you can all use and apply to really any company. 1, ensure systems are in place for the board's monitoring or the company's executives monitoring and oversight of material ESG risks. In other words, how do you identify, enterprise level ESG issues, attending trainings like this, watching regulatory developments, and engaging with your stakeholders to identify what are those emerging areas of regulation or risk that are coming for our company, and how are we going to navigate that? 2, in certain cases, seek third-party assurance of your data. This is particularly important for material data. So if your investors are relying on, or your customers are relying on greenhouse gas emissions data, for example, then it's best practice to have that validated by a third party who has expertise in that. It takes the liability off of you, and it increases the credibility of that data. And then establish clear internal controls with respect to ESG practices, who's responsible for what. Distinguish clearly between factual and aspirational aspects. So saying something is a goal is helpful. Using seek to or aspire type language is helpful, but really what is important is conveying to what extent for a commitment you have developed a path to get there. That's the thing that has been, the expectation that's been evolving in the market, is that it's not enough to just set a 2050 goal. There should be interim timelines. There should be a path to get there, and where there's uncertainty in how you will achieve those goals, to describe that and assumptions that are made. ensuring consistency of regulatory disclosures and voluntary disclosures. That's important. I mean, sometimes you're switching between, carbon intensity versus absolute carbon, and ensuring that those terms are not misplaced and that there is consistency, or where you don't have consistency, there is a reason for that. Tracking market trends, regulatory developments, and stakeholder expectations. I'll show you on the next slide what you can do to stay abreast of those. And coordinating disclosures with internal and outside counsel or advisors, making sure you have the right viewpoints, especially when companies become more complex and more siloed, to make sure that disclosures are viewed from not just the marketing, and legal perspective, but also a variety of subject matter expertise. And then consider what information is missing. So I think this is the next stage of greenwashing litigation. It's not what was said and was inaccurate, but actually what wasn't said, what assumptions were made that were not conveyed. And so those are just some tips to really apply to any type of ESG or climate related risk or disclosure. We'll share our contact information again at the end, but what I wanted to point you to was the Kirkland ESG Roundup. We send this out on a weekly basis. It's an incredibly useful resource, or so my clients say. And it contains an update on market trends, regulatory developments, and coalitions, many of which are relevant to real estate and venture. So that I'll turn it back to Paige.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Alex and Paul. That, if anyone needs a glossary of some of the acronyms that were used, or if you just simply want the slides, definitely go ahead and get in touch with them, and I'll make the same sort of email slides available at the end of this webinar, which will be available for 30 days after we finish here. So if you didn't catch all of it, no worries. You can always rewatch or send us an email to take a look at those slides with us. So now we're going to stay on this theme of sort of data and regulation, but we're going to get specific now with a couple of company presentations. So these are going to be pretty quick hitting. And first, we're going to start with data, and we're going to have Zach Robin present from Measurable. Now, Zach is new to Measurable, sort of, but definitely not new to the business. He came from Hatch Data, and I got to work with him in a previous life. So I'm really delighted to introduce him and allow him to drop some knowledge about the world's premier ESG data platform. Go ahead, Zach.
Thanks, Paige. And as Alex and Paige highlighted, Alex and Paul highlighted, the current combination of regulatory and market pressure has really brought ESG matters into the spotlight, and it's no longer sufficient to wait and see. It's time for us to act. So, in one way, what was once aspirational is now an essential part of how we do business. A firm's goals and performance directly affect value, access to capital, and in some cases, the ability to attract high quality tenants. Companies that are able to make timely and high quality decisions backed by real data will gain competitive advantage, while others struggle. The world's largest investors have already recognized this moment. Many of you are already taking action to seize it. You can see the quote on the bottom from Larry Fink at BlackRock. This is not a point in time, it is the beginning of a transition, and firms that seize this moment will be in best shape. However, it can be difficult to make this transition for a few reasons. Number one, collecting ESG data is difficult. Depending on the structure of your organization, the amount of third parties involved, the geographies covered, just getting access to utility invoices and policies and activities going on across the portfolio can really be a challenge. Second, once you have all of those data, figuring out which regimes you're going to disclose towards can also be a complicated process. And as Alex mentioned, ever-changing. Which region, which fund, which voluntary, which mandatory ordinances do you need to comply with really requires a systematic approach and a partner. And third, with all of that time spent on collecting data and reporting and disclosing data, there's rarely time left over to actually engage the individual site teams and ensure they have the tools, the support, and the resources to prioritize improvements to dramatically achieve the performance benefits that we're seeking. Measurable was founded almost a decade ago, specifically to solve this problem and meet this moment. Our software platform has grown over that time to encompass solutions for these three major buckets of challenges. So we streamline the data collection process, both through automating utility data, as well as providing consistent workflows for gathering data around the S and the G. We simplify the disclosure process by making benchmarking and identification of which disclosure regimes are required an easy and consistent process across a portfolio. For organizations who report, for example, to CDP or GRESB, that can be done completely from within the platform without needing to juggle spreadsheets or work with manual processes. And lastly, we connect the ESG programs and ambitions from the boardroom down to the boiler room by linking corporate goals directly with the workflows at the site level. And we do that through a variety of different means, most notably identifying specific decarbonization opportunities at the asset level. But we're not doing it alone. So we have been had the pleasure of working side by side with leaders in the industry for the past decade. I have two examples here of very savvy owners and operators who have either launched or scaled their ESG programs on the Measurable platform and achieved the rewards and performance improvements they had sought. This example here of us partnering with USA Real Estate saw them drastically reduce both the time needed to capture and disclose ESG data, but also to ensure that they had a fully auditable record of their progress and achievements. This resulted in them seeing improvements in their public benchmarking and GRESB scores, as you can see here, and also allowed them to document significant improvements in cost savings across the portfolio. In the second example here in Naveen, this is an example now going from the portfolio down to an individual region and set of assets where the team at Naveen recognized that there was more they could do to engage the site teams and the operational workflows and ensure they had the tools needed to support operational improvements and deep decarbonization by capturing what we always call the low-hanging fruit of operational efficiency, energy efficiency, and ensure the buildings are being run well. And this is a great example because it was already a marquee property, LEED Gold certified, and we were still able to support that team in continuous improvement. So nearly 1,000 customers entrust us to help them scale their ESG efforts across the globe, across more than 15 billion square feet. We've learned a lot through these engagements. We continue to learn, and we take all of those learnings, put them back into the platform so all customers can benefit from what we're seeing across the globe. So in summary, ESG is now a requirement. I think that's been hammered enough times in this webinar, but it doesn't need to be difficult. Collective industry action is needed if we are to achieve our global ESG goals. And I hope you'll join us. As a special offer for the audience today, Measurable is offering a free ESG program maturity assessment. So that's where we will come, we'll sit down with you, we'll talk about your current state, where you'd like to get to, share best practices we're seeing, and map a roadmap or a journey. I hope you'll reach out. My contact info is included here. And with that, I'll hand it back to Paige. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Zach. That is an incredible overview of what is possible with the right data and the right platform. And now we're going to transition from the sort of platform view globally, and we're going to get down into that very tricky, elusive, somewhat difficult to measure scope 3. So we're going to hear from Dean and Kairos Water that'll teach us a little bit about scope 3 and ESG initiatives. Go ahead, Dean. Thank you.
All right. Next slide. Look familiar? If you've been in the industry long enough, you've experienced the frustration of walking into your buildings only to find soggy ceilings and soaked floors and maybe an angry resident or tenant. Maybe you're lucky and it seems like a shooting star far off in the distance. It's only a matter of time before you'll see that 1 star show up in a scathing review. Managers and owners have so many other things to worry about to maximize the economic and physical life of a property. Waiting for things to show up or blow up just doesn't seem right, and there must be a better way. Hi, my name is Dean. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Kairos. We are purpose-driven to help owners and operators everywhere secure a more resilient and sustainable future through intelligent water metering and leak detection technology. Here are 3 key areas we're focused on at Kairos. Number 1, reducing repair and maintenance expenses caused by in-building source water damage with advanced leak detection technology. Number 2, improving water consumption and utility expense recovery with advanced sub-metering technology. And lastly, partnering with insurance carriers to significantly reduce claims while advocating rate relief for owners and operators who adopt this risk management technology. In 2021, over $300 billion of global losses for property and casualty were assessed as a result of in-building sourced water damage. And in the United States, over $20 billion. Texas alone in 2021, from the winter freeze, experienced over $9 billion of asset damage. And you can think about all that waste, that soggy ceiling, that soaked floor, that wood, that carpet that ends up in a landfill and its impact on the environment. Deductibles have risen over 300% in the last 5 years alone, creating massive uninsured exposure and impact to NOI for owners. On top of all that, while we're finding more renewable sources of energy, the cost of water as a utility expense continues to outpace the others, rising at 3x inflation. Simply said, water problems threaten NOI, and the potential losses in exposure are significant. It's been said, how do you walk through a field full of landmines? You follow someone. I've been in over 14,000 homes, and I've seen over 3,000 water damage cases with my own eyes as a technician with over 15 years of experience. Water is a tricky enemy to tackle, trust me. That is why exactly in 2017, I set out to develop this comprehensive leak detection and smart submetering solution to provide your site teams with rapid response capabilities in emergency situations. This patented leak detection device on the left, we call NOAA, combines best-in-class hardware and software that is flexible and scalable to protect your building for up to 10 years on a single battery. Our newest product, launching later this year, is an advanced water meter with an integrated emergency shutoff valve and high-resolution consumption monitoring sensors, allowing owners to analyze data to meet ESG and expense reduction targets. You may be asking, where does this get installed? Well, we usually create a custom plan to guide owners to start with leak detection in high-risk areas like mechanical spaces for HVAC and water heaters. Here's an example of a mechanical room for domestic water supply in a high-rise building, as well as an elevator shaft where we've created a containment area using our flexible strip sensor technology. On the bottom right, you'll see a T sensor for a bathroom application. On the left is a 20 by 20 sensor for a laundry room application. Our network does more with less. In fact, we use 35 times fewer gateways with 1,500% longer signal range when compared to consumer smart apartment base stations. It allows us to cover more with less. Our software can send immediate notifications at critical moments via the application layer, SMS, email, and even after-hours phone calls. And you may be asking, what's the ROI? But the real question is, what's the risk of ignoring? Here's a story of our first customer. It's an office building in downtown San Francisco that had an expansion valve crack on the 10th floor of the building, causing over $300,000 worth of water damage. We installed our leak detection sensors in December of 2020, and within 5 months caught a leak at another expansion valve when the chief building engineer received a text message while he was on the beaches of Mexico. And his backup engineer went and took care of it by draining all 20 floors in the building and fixed the expansion valve with zero water damage, an ROI of 3,400% in less than 5 months. Our teams have now installed over 15,000 sensors and over 7,000 apartments to date, with every customer achieving an ROI in less than 6 months and 0 customers having to file an insurance claim for water damage post-install. When we think about ESG, we like to add the R for resiliency, because it's both the economic resiliency of the building and the asset and the community and the portfolio, but it's also the physical resiliency of that building. So we automate the data collection through advanced metering technology, whether it's clamp-on ultrasonic solutions to measure how much water is being utilized at a cooling tower, or whether it is in-unit measurement for sub-metering and utility expense recovery, right? If you can, measure how much water consumption is in a building, you can then, detect those anomalies, take care of that leaky toilet bowl flapper or that stuck dump valve on a cooling tower, and it allows you to save a ton of money on water. Most people don't understand that water takes as much energy to heat, treat, and pump through a building as it does to run an HVAC system for an entire year. It actually amounts to about 8% of the energy budget in a building. So water is energy. And so finally, when we talk about resiliency, we talk about protecting these assets with advanced leak detection technology, because then you don't have to throw that drywall, that wood, that concrete, and that carpet in the dumpster. And so we help you to kind of maintain that and create that path to peace and protection and profits and peace of mind. And thank you for joining. If you're interested in taking a look at our technology further and piloting it, we're available. Just reach out to our team or the Modern Ventures team, and we'll be happy to help. Available for any questions in case anyone has.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Dean. We're asking folks to kind of put your questions in the Q&A. Thank you for those that have put those there so far. We're going to roll those up and answer those all at once live at the end of the webinar. And so we're going to take it now. We've got to come from the portfolio level. We've gone down to the building level. And now we're going to get a little bit more specific and almost take it down to the consumer level. When we talk about electrification of fuel sources, that's a big trend, and all the way down to the things that get us around every day, the cars that we drive. So next we'll be hearing from Eric at Zeal. So thank you so much for joining us, Eric.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paige. Thank you guys for having me. Zeal is a technology-first electric vehicle charging company. And so when we think about electric vehicles, they've been around for about a decade, and the first cohort of drivers were really kind of the eco-conscious folks. It was the Nissan Leaf driver in the Bay Area or the Chevy Bolt driver in Denver, Colorado. But it's really going mainstream because these electric vehicles are really computers on wheels. And so when you think about this next wave of EV drivers, it's not just the extremely eco-conscious. It's not just the Tesla homeowner or the luxury Rivian. It's the everyday vehicle is going electric. And obviously we all know the story of why that's beneficial from a decarbonization perspective. But the problem is that with all these cars coming, we need to have the infrastructure in place to welcome it, because you have the chicken or the egg. If we don't build it, they won't come. And once they come, we're too late to put in the infrastructure. So we're really at that tipping point. Last year, 5% of all new car sales went electric. That's the tipping point when Norway and China started to accelerate the electrification curve. And so we are finally starting to hit that place. And if you don't drive electric on this call right now, if you're not one of those people, it's highly likely that your next car will be. And that's true of the people that work in our office buildings, and that's true of the tenants that live in our apartment buildings. Next slide. So Zeal is of the category you would call a smart networked charger. And so why does an electric vehicle charging station need to be smart, right? Like, why can't it just be an outlet on the wall the way you charge your phone? Well, a smart charging network needs to have built-in intelligence. It needs to be able to do payment processing. It needs to be able to do access control to know who's using it. We need to know smart metering, right? We need to know how much electricity is being consumed through these, and then be able to communicate that to building intelligence or back to the utilities. So Zeal is an end-to-end electric vehicle charging company. We are both the hardware, we are the software and the brains, and we oversee the rollout of these charging solutions across numerous different asset classes, but mostly focused on multifamily and office. So the problem in the electric vehicle charging space right now is that we have a bottleneck issue. Over 50% of the charging stations that are out in the world are either non-functional, like all the time, or some of the time. And the reason why this is happening is because of a bottleneck around central networking. So these charging stations require a central connection to an internet source to function, to allow you to charge your car. And if that does not happen, it will strand the driver, leaving someone unable to go to work or unable to drive their child to the hospital if they need to. Like, this is unacceptable, and this can't be the norm if the future is going to be a decarbonized transportation network. And so that singular problem around networking is the reason why charging stations are failing right now. And so introducing Zeal, where we come into the market, and the pain point that we're solving is that we're the first ever fully self-reliant charging network. Our chargers need no IT infrastructure. They could be 10 stories underground, or they could be on a surface lot. But the point is that it is going to work 100% of the time because we've cut out that bottleneck issue that's going to allow a driver to comfortably drive up to a station and know that it's going to turn on, know that it's going to process the payment, give them direct access to the charging station, and the utility is going to get that information about how much electricity has been consumed. So we do this because we have a patent around a protocol that's built into our charger that essentially turns it into an edge computer. And so it's a token and ledger system where every single driver is self-reliant, brings their data to the charging station, and then that ledger of new information is then communicated up to the cloud via the phone. So the charging station itself never needs that central internet connection. Super, super easy to use for every driver. They have full transparency into the cost that they're paying for the electricity. And it's just a really clean and easy experience. I like to say we're kind of like the Peloton of EV charging. We're trying not to look like a utility, but we're trying to look like an amenity, a beautiful experience, and something that's enjoyable to use. And our business model is focusing on real estate owners that understand the impact of this, coming up with a thoughtful EV charging strategy, helping them size their portfolio, helping advise where to put the charging stations, and helping them think more holistically versus project by project. So these logos you see rely on us to do more analysis than maybe just a one-off project. We're doing quarterly business reviews. We're showing them their carbon savings. We're showing the equivalent number of gallons of gas saved from being consumed. And so we have a very high touch experience that we provide for our clients. And this is what it looks like out in the wild. So you can put it on, you can put it on a wall, you can put it on a pillar, it can be on a pedestal, but really it's a charging station that can go absolutely anywhere and does not need the biggest bottleneck issue, which is around IT. So that's what we're doing. We're super excited to continue our relationships in the commercial real estate industry and expand from there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Eric, for covering the electrification theme and kind of where we're at in that 5% tipping point. Now for the rest of the webinar, we're going to wrap up and we're going to try and hit some of the questions that have come through in the chat so far. So Alex and I will just kind of go through some high-level takeaways. And I think that there were a couple that were interesting, specific to frameworks. The first one was kind of for Alex, perhaps. Which one's going to win and how do we know?
Well, unfortunately, I've got another acronym for you, which is the ISSB, the International Standard Setting Board. It's seeking to resolve all of these conflicting frameworks and would definitely be the one to watch, but we're not there yet. So we've got a couple of years, I think, at a minimum left to go in competing frameworks. And the important thing is for companies to understand them and to pick the ones that are best for them and their stakeholders. And continue looking to how that's going to fit into the ISSB disclosures over time, as well as the regulatory disclosures that are required for that company. So that would be regulation number one. It's just, continue to take it in, but focus. Yeah. And then, in terms of scope 3, I saw another question around, why would SEC leave out scope 3? I mean, that's a question for the SEC and ultimately a question of what's going to help this rule withstand the likely judicial scrutiny that they're going to face and in terms of what's material. Even if it's out, I think we're going to continue to see, as Paul talked about, a lot of pressure to disclose scope 3 anyway from other forms. And as I mentioned, the FAR rule as well could require scope 3. So there's a number of ways in which that could come into play. But whittling down scope 3. So making sure that, again, you go through that initial scoping phase of what's really material and important to focus on scope 3 and where are we able to really push levers to make changes and not just calculating for the sake of calculating. So with that, I mean, I think our takeaways here are continue to focus. really making sure that you're taking in all the resources that exist and staying abreast of new regulation, new technologies, and also make sure that you're viewing regulation as an opportunity. It's not just a downside risk, but something to watch from the opportunity side in terms of where can we transition our business to take advantage of emerging regulation. So that's all from Kirkland. Thanks, Paige.
Awesome, Alex. Thank you so much. I think the scope 3 is going to be an ongoing talk by steps really through the rest of this year, that, as Dean pointed out, it's not just measuring trash or waste or water, it's everything that's associated with that. It's the energy to heat or cool or move that trash. And as we get to real estate specifically, scope 3 is sometimes someone else's problem. If you're maybe in a residential space where really it's ultimately the tenant's responsibility on the inside, but it's becoming much more of a discussion, and getting your arms around that data through measurable or other platforms is critical to business operations now, before the data is really due and the homework has to be turned in. And I think that one of the other themes I was thinking about is, I'm going through all the ESG companies in our portfolio and the technology that underpins it. You heard this from Zeal, you heard this from Kairos, that connectivity without fail is something that we need to be able to expect and inspect. We learned that through the pandemic, and it's never more true than today to say, there are too many point solutions doing one thing in a property. How can I get them to roll up to speak to one another so that I can then turn around and make accurate disclosures and depend on data that my investors are counting on? So those are some of the things I think where the technology and the investor demand come together, and getting the right sort of data so that we're prepared for things that are coming around the bend. And thank you, Alex and Paul, both for kind of helping us see around corners. And I encourage you all to kind of reach out and get in touch with us. I think we tackled most of the comments in that section. One other one I would say, if we have a few extra moments, is that incentives is a big deal when it comes to areas that have been, or properties that have been regulated to the point where, you need to meet some different performance standards for compliance. There are plenty of companies out there that can help you with that. That goes without saying that each of the companies here on this page specialize in either broad incentives or narrow incentives for water or EV charging. And finally, there's a fourth company called Incentive Find as a part of the Modern portfolio that can also help with that as well. So I think we've tackled all the questions, but I'm sure there will be much more. And I loved Alex's metaphor of ESG regulation as a surfboard. So we better learn how to ride real well. Thank you, everybody. Encourage you to reach out with any more questions we can answer for you. Have a great day, y'all.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thanks.